formed, you guessed it, 501c3 charitable educational foundations and began to push their agenda. And so in 1919 is when Congress began to limit these 501c3s from electioneering and pamphleteering. Not because the churches were doing anything, but because of what these pro-communist groups. One of the groups that was communist was founded by a World War I draft dodger named Roger Baldwin.
Oh, yes.
And he spent a year in jail as a draft dodger, and he got out and decided to defend those who were accused of being communists, and he started a group called ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union. This is a quote from Roger Baldwin. He says, I don't regret being part of the communist tactic. He says, I was not an innocent liberal. I wanted what the communists wanted. Roger Baldwin went over to the Soviet Union and wrote a book called Liberty Under the Soviets. Roger Baldwin went to Vietnam and embraced their communist dictator Ho Chi Minh. And Roger Baldwin said, I am for socialism, disarmament, and ultimately the abolishing of the state itself. He says, I seek social ownership of property, the abolition of the propertied class, the abolition of the propertied class.
Wow.
And sole control of those who produce wealth. Communism is the goal. This is Roger Baldwin, founder of the ACLU, who was given the Congressional Gold Medal of Freedom or Medal of Freedom by Jimmy Carter. Anyway, so here, Roger Baldwin starts this 501c3.
Yes.
And then his friend, Margaret Sanger, starts a 501c3 called Planned Parenthood.
Yes.
All these groups are jumping into this 501c3 category, groups to prevent cruelty to animals. Even Playboy has a 501c3 foundation. And when this started happening, Congress said, hey, we got to limit 501c3s some more. So in 1939, they limited so 501c3s could not use a substantial amount of their money for influencing legislation, although they didn't define what substantial was. But pastors could still endorse candidates. But that changed in 1954, which I get into in the book.
Slowly but surely, tax exemption became linked with state control of speech. And it happened, it came through the back door. By the way, Bill, this book of yours, Endangered Speeches, I keep trying to say endangered species, it ranges very widely. It talks about communism in general, Whittaker Chambers, Alger Hiss, anti-communism. It talks about the communist modality, which is, by the way, to create an artificial conflict, to create a crisis, and jump in with the solution. We're seeing some of that today.
Yeah. And what happened is the communist idea was to trying to find the fault lines in a country, whether it was the rich against the poor, blacks against the whites, Christians against the Muslims, Catholics against the Protestants, the Hutus against the Tutsis. I mean, it really didn't matter who the two sides were. They would go in and organize the have-nots, promising to give them what the haves have, and they would stir up tension. They wanted racial crisis. They wanted that because once a revolution began and there's killing in the streets, everybody would give up their rights and freedoms to restore law and order, and they would be in control, and they would set up a dictatorship. Stalin, Pol Pot, Ho Chi Minh, Castro, Mao Zedong. And as they began to take over these countries, that's when you had these governments decide to limit, what they could do more. But I get into it all in the book. It's fascinating.
And we go from the church being more or less the conscience of the state to the present situation in which the church is forbidden from being the conscience of the state, right?
Right. And what happened was in the 1950s, I mean, Mao Zedong killed 80 million in his communist takeover, cultural revolution in China. Pol Pot killed millions in Cambodia, the killing fields. And the communists took over Hungary and imprisoned, Cardinal Manzini and Richard Wurmbrand, who started the Voice of Martyrs. And as these communists, North Korea was taking over. As these communists took over in the 40s and 50s, that's when there were anti-communist 501c3 educational foundations being formed in America.
Wow.
And they were highlighting politicians and speaking out against politicians like FDR's New Deal and LBJ, Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson, long story short, didn't like this 501c3 in Texas, founded by H.L. Hunt, the oil millionaire, and it was called the Facts Forum, F-A-C-T-S, Facts Forum. And it was highlighting LBJ's leftist, globalist, socialist leanings, and began to target him. And LBJ didn't like this, so he pushed through the Senate a bill to stop 501c3s from endorsing candidates, and it passed in 1954.
54. Well, I'd like to go on, and I'm sure you'd like to hear more. The book, Endangered Speeches, How the ACLU, IRS, and LBJ Threaten the Extinction of Free Speech. Bill Federer, we're going to have to continue this, but thanks for being with us today. This has been a Prophecy in the News update. Tune in again, and we'll have another conversation with Bill Federer.